A new wave of tit-for-tat attacks a week after Hezbollah and Israel reached a ceasefire. Now concerns about whether the fragile agreement will hold. Hello everyone, I'm Asiye Namdar sitting in for Anna Naidu, and you're watching The Heat. A ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon could be in jeopardy. Both sides have exchanged fire in recent days and blamed one another for the violence. The U.S., which along with France brokered the agreement, says the truce for the most part appears to be holding. Jonathan Regev has more from Tel Aviv.
Both sides seem to blame the other for violations. The two rockets that were fired from Hezbollah yesterday afternoon came, according to Hezbollah, in response to Israeli breaches of violations. This is according to what the organization is saying. There have been, according to Hezbollah, some 50 incidents or so in which Israel fired towards Lebanon. And shortly after those rockets fired from Lebanon came the Israeli response with fire towards Hezbollah installations. We're hearing of at least 15 people in Lebanon being killed. Having said all that, both sides, Israel and Lebanon, not Israel and Hezbollah, but Israel and Lebanon, have reiterated to the American mediators that they will continue to comply with the ceasefire agreement, meaning it is still in place, but it's very, very fragile, meaning it can collapse at any minute. We can see that there are constant incidents, constant violations of both sides. Both sides are saying that the other is violated it. So the ceasefire is in place. Yes. Is it at risk of collapsing? Also yes. And we've visited the communities in northern Israel this week. They're still empty. People are still not coming back because of the sort of a lack of faith in this ceasefire, which tonight we'll see exactly a week since it was signed. But it's very, very fragile at this time.
That was Jonathan Regev reporting from Tel Aviv. Now, to talk more about the situation in the Middle East, let's bring in our panel from Newark, New Jersey. Sahar Aziz is a distinguished professor of law at Rutgers University. From New Haven in Connecticut, Joost Hiltermann is program director for Middle East and North Africa at the International Crisis Group. Here in Washington, D.C., Dan Arbell is scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at American University. Also from Washington, D.C., Khalil Jahshan. He's the executive director of the Arab Center. Welcome to all of you. Joost, let me begin with you. This fragile ceasefire between Hezbollah and Lebanon, there is some concern that perhaps it's headed in a direction no one wants to see. This whole thing, is it at the risk of collapsing at this point?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on the program. Of course, there's a risk of collapse, and we've seen the UN has already reported 100 violations by Israel of the ceasefire. But at the same time, as we already heard, so far it has held by and large. And that gives ground for hope. But it is also clear that the balance of power between Israel and Hezbollah remains great after the attacks we've seen by Israel on Hezbollah in the last 2 or 3 months. And this means that for Israel, it is more tempting to commit violations of the ceasefire, and for Hezbollah, it is less tempting. Now, Israel, therefore, may try to achieve some of its military objectives. In the end, what it wants to accomplish in Lebanon is to have a situation in southern Lebanon, at least, if not in all of Lebanon, that would allow the Israelis who have been displaced from northern Israel to return to their homes.
And Joost, these kinds of tit-for-tat violations, they're not all that unusual when you are dealing with Lebanon and Hezbollah and Israel, when you have a ceasefire like this.
Well, it's certainly a vast improvement over what we saw in the weeks before the ceasefire. It is more akin to what we saw during the past year, until the escalation that began after the killing of Nasrallah and a large part of the Hezbollah leadership in command. So in a sense, we've seen all of this before, but it doesn't bring stability, it doesn't bring safety to the civilians in the area, whether on whichever side of the border. And so it's not really sustainable. And what we need to reach is a deal that both sides can agree to. And I know it is between Israel and Lebanon, but by default, it's between Israel and Hezbollah, that would allow civilians on both sides of the border to return to their homes.
Khalil, how much control does the Lebanese government have over Hezbollah's actions?
Very little indeed. They hope that their influence would increase in light of the ceasefire arrangement and the role they were given by that dictated ceasefire arrangement. However, their influence is indeed somewhat limited. I mean, we're talking here about a state within a state. For all practical purposes, a situation that has been going on for years. The government, the central government in Lebanon has not been functional. Elections have not been taking place. But at any rate, this is kind of, like I said, a dictated arrangement, not quite a ceasefire. Therefore, it's doubly more fragile than your normal ceasefire. And the fact of the matter that it was negotiated or imposed, if you will, in a hurry, without negotiating, if you will, the underlying factors, the political factors that needed to be negotiated. So if it is to succeed long term, and if it's to last, and we hope that it would in terms of saving lives on all sides, one would think that the parties involved, the mediators in particular, would come back and plug the gaps, if you will, in this agreement to enhance its life.
Yeah, this is a 60-day agreement, which is supposed to happen in phases. Dan, let me move on to you. Israel's defense minister has threatened that if the ceasefire in Lebanon collapses, Israeli forces will no longer differentiate between Lebanon and Hezbollah. First of all, I'm not sure I understand. What does that even mean? And how much of this, in your opinion, is just a political posturing by Israel?
So first of all, I think that everybody needs to remember Hezbollah really needs the ceasefire, and Israel really wants the ceasefire, but not at all cost. What the minister is saying is that Israel has tried to hold Hezbollah responsible for its actions and not extract a toll from the Lebanese government, from the sovereign Lebanese state. But what Katz is saying is basically that if war resumes, then Israel will not differentiate between Hezbollah and the Lebanese state, the Lebanese army, Lebanese targets, and so on and so forth.
Lebanese civilians?
No, look, they're not going to be targeting Lebanese civilians, but they will be perhaps looking at Lebanese targets, state targets.
But Dan, you do realize a lot of civilians have lost their lives in Israeli strikes in southern Lebanon and Beirut.
What we're looking at really is, first of all, posturing by the minister, but signaling that at any given point, if Israel feels that Hezbollah is violating the agreement in a major way, Israel will step in and respond forcefully again and resume the fighting. And in that round, when Israel resumes its fighting, it's not going to differentiate between the Lebanese state and Hezbollah.
All right, let me move on to Gaza. While there's been this ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel in Lebanon, no sign of any kind of truce or agreement happening in Gaza. 14 months into this crisis, the Gaza Health Ministry says more than 44,000 Palestinians have been killed. The UN says the majority of them women and children. Much of Gaza bombed and destroyed. Schools, healthcare facilities, aid convoys, aid workers have been hit. There's increasing hunger and starvation. And of course, winter is only going to make things worse. Let's take a listen to Amina Mohammed, the UN Deputy Secretary General, speaking about the situation in Cairo just on Monday.
Let us be clear. The nightmare in Gaza is not a crisis of logistics. It is a crisis of political will and respect for fundamental principles of international humanitarian law.
She said it's a crisis of political will. Sahar, let me turn to you. Does the Biden administration bear some of the responsibility here for what critics say its really unwavering support for Israel, for continuing to provide weapons to Israel, and for President Biden not putting enough pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. Critics say this nightmare could have ended a long time ago.
Well, Israel clearly seems to have one objective, which is to kill as many Palestinians through bombing, starvation, and medical disaster as it possibly can in Gaza. And if it can ethnically cleanse the rest, it will do so. Regardless what some of the politicians are saying otherwise, the people we should be listening to are the ones in the Knesset, the ones in Netanyahu's cabinet, and Netanyahu himself, which is that if they could physically do it, they would cleanse Gaza of all Palestinians through killing or ethnic cleansing. Once we accept that that is their objective is not to bring home the hostages, because there were multiple deals that Hamas agreed to where the hostages could have been brought back, and Netanyahu and his cabinet rejected it. The objective is not to have some kind of a truce or ceasefire, because that has also been on the table multiple times. And so one cannot conclude otherwise that they want perpetual war until they can figure out a way to get rid of these Palestinians, or at best put them into the smallest possible territory in southern Gaza, and at some point hope that the Egyptians will take them into Sinai. Once you accept that is the reality, that is the true objective, which is why Israel is being accused of genocide as opposed to just chronic war crimes, then you realize that by providing military arms in 1,000, 2,000 ton bombs and all sorts of weapons and fighter jets by the United States, $20 billion worth, then of course the United States is aiding and abetting that. And the question becomes is, will the U.S. government, whether they're Republican-controlled or Democratic-controlled, change that agenda or change that policy? And that's really going to be up to the American people. But I think that at this point, Israel as a nation has become a pariah state. And whatever Congress may say otherwise in its unconditional support, all over the world, people are watching social media. They're seeing the videos for themselves. They're hearing the perspectives and the experiences of Palestinians that are being ethnically cleansed, starved, and killed in Gaza. And pictures don't lie. Videos don't lie. So at this point, at least as an American citizen and as someone who believes in human rights and believes in international law, I think it's incumbent on all Americans to ask themselves, do they want to aid and abet this genocidal campaign that has no end, led by Netanyahu?
Well, I'm going to ask Dan, what is the Israeli objective at this point? I mean, in the start of this conflict, shortly after the October 7th attacks, Israel said it's going to eliminate Hamas. It wants to make sure something like this never happens again. What is the Israeli objective 14 months into this war?
First of all that Sahar has said is utterly false. Total baseless claims.
Which part is false, Dan?
Hamas is the one responsible for what's happening to the innocent people of Gaza. Hamas is the one that's preventing from humanitarian aid to reach places in need. Hamas is the one that is embedding in civilian populations, exposing innocent civilians to attacks. Hamas was the one that opened the war on October 7th. So please don't lecture Israel.
Let me tell. Well, hold on a second, Dan. Let me just tell you one thing. No one here is questioning the brutality of what happened on October 7th.
The previous speaker has not mentioned the brutality of Hamas, but that's fine.
Of course, October 7th was brutal, but you do not engage in a campaign of genocide in retribution.
Yeah. Right, sure. But in any case, I think that the Israeli government's objectives remain very clear. They want to dismantle Hamas, remove it from the equation of being a force that controls Gaza, bring back the hostages, and ensure that October 7th does not happen again. These are the goals, and I think that now where the front in Lebanon has been settled somewhat, I think Israel will move together with what remains in the Biden term and also with Trump's team to get to a ceasefire in Gaza.
Let me tell you guys what Israel's. Hold on.
Many of the human shields. So first of all, Israel has used numerous.
Sahar, hold on 1 second. Just give me 1 second.
There's been evidence that shows that they are not using human shields in hospitals, in schools that are bombed, in universities that are bombed.
Sahar, let me interrupt you. Sahar, let me interrupt you because I'm going to actually continue this conversation, but you got to allow me to interject and ask questions. Israel's former defense minister, he's also a former army chief, Moshe Yaalon. This man is highly decorated, served 3 decades in the IDF. In an interview over the weekend, I don't know if you've seen it, he accused Israel of committing ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza. I'm quoting here, conquering, annexing, ethnic cleansing, he said. Look at northern Gaza. This is what Yaalon told Israel's Democrat TV. Accusations the IDF and Netanyahu's government have rejected. I want to get your perspective on this man saying what he said. Sahar, I'll let you go on, and then I want to get reaction from Dan and Joost and also Khalil.
I think the problem with those who are unconditionally supporting Israel and making excuse for every single war crime and violation of international law that they're engaging in, which apparently one of my co-panelists is doing, is that they are not taking accountability and responsibility for Israel's violations of international war. Hamas committed international war crimes on October 7, 2023. Nobody's disputing that. The dispute is that you cannot collectively punish 2.4 million civilian Palestinians in the way that Israel has done indefinitely for 14 months unless you believe that every Palestinian civilian, which is false. And so if you actually look at and listen to the politicians that are in power, they have dehumanized them and essentially said, everyone is Hamas, everyone can be killed, and international law doesn't apply to us, and if you dare accuse us of that, we'll just say it's Hamas's fault. This is a military that is the best equipped in the region. It has $20 billion of support by the United States. It is a nation state. It cannot blame a non-state state actor that committed war crimes on October 7th for all of its own war crimes.
Well, let me move on. Hold on.
And I just want to end. What is your end game? If you think that you're going to eliminate Hamas, fine, eliminate Hamas. That was the same objective with the PLO. There will be another resistance movement because the fundamental core problem is that Israel is militarily occupying 6 million people in the Gaza and the West Bank, and the Israeli government refuses to create a two-state
All right,
solution.
let me move on. Okay, we gotta let other people talk here. Joost, let me go to you. First of all, what do you make of the fact that Israel's former defense minister is supporting here what Sahar has been saying, that what Israel is doing in northern Gaza, according to Israel's former defense minister, Moshe Yaalon, is in fact ethnic cleansing? How significant is that?
Oh, so first of all, I don't want to get into a fight between Israelis and Palestinians. It's not my job, not my role. But just on this particular question, it is proven time and again that some of the strongest critics of Israel and the Israeli actions in Gaza, also in Lebanon, are Israelis. And so it is not surprising that a person of the stature and experience with Moshe Yaalon that he would say something like that. Of course, there have been other voices in Israel which have been just as strong. Also, in the Jewish diaspora, you've had voices, people who are experts on genocide, and the Israelis know about genocide, so who have come out clearly and said this is beyond the pale. So I'm not so surprised. But in the end, it's not really what changes policy. And this is what we need to be worried about. What we've seen is the UN has time and again placed the blame for the scarcity of humanitarian aid going into Gaza on Israel, not on Hamas. Hamas is diminished, greatly diminished. Cannot even. What we've seen is that there are armed gangs that are attacking aid convoys. It's according to the UN, it's not Hamas. It's also one reason why Israel is trying to stifle the UN in Gaza, because it is speaking directly against what the Israeli government would like you to believe. And this is really unfortunate. But in the end, what we need to do, we need to come to a ceasefire in Gaza that would allow. I mean, it should be happening even without a ceasefire, but it will be easier with a ceasefire that would allow humanitarian aid to come in huge volumes to aid a population that is in a desperate situation, that is starving, that is facing winter, as you mentioned, and that has absolutely no hope of any improvement and may, in fact, face in the future further displacement.
Khalil, let me turn to you. Donald Trump has demanded the immediate release of all Israeli hostages still being held by Hamas. On his social media post today, he said, if they're not freed before he takes office in January, there will be hell to pay. And again, I'm quoting. Is he threatening to get U.S. directly involved in this conflict? And what will a second Trump administration mean for Palestinians? What will it mean for Gaza?
Frankly, it's a typical Trump statement, meaningless, sounds tough. But with all due respect to the president-elect, I understand if he's been following things in Gaza over the past 14 or 15 months. There has been hell on earth in Gaza, so he's not threatening with anything new. And the U.S. hasn't been a bystander. His predecessor, Mr. Biden, has been a partner in this war, and the U.S. has been involved with everything that it has to offer, including aircraft carriers, including jets, including intelligence information, including supplying Israel with tools and weapons to proceed with this genocidal war. So there is nothing new in this threat. The fact of the matter, you know, if he indeed was serious about his administration and his foreign policy with regards to a key issue where the U.S. is involved as a party, he needs to understand that this is day 424 of a war of ethnic cleansing, where even the former vice prime minister of Israel, former minister of strategic affairs, former minister of defense, former chief of staff admits it's ethnic cleansing. And you cannot deny that. So he needs to take that into consideration. We're talking about 44,500 people as of today dead. Let's assume Israel killed 14,000. Hamas, what about the 30,000, double that, in civilians killed by the Israelis using American weapons and American resources and American diplomatic support?
Well, let's go to Dan. I want to let him respond. Dan.
So, look, first of all, I have great admiration for Minister Ya'alon, and what Minister Ya'alon said was much more nuanced than this headline. He expressed concern that statements by far-right ministers may lead to actions which may lead to ethnic cleansing. He did not call what Israel is doing in northern Gaza ethnic cleansing. He alluded that it may happen and warned that it should not happen, but he did not say that it's ethnic cleansing that is actually happening. Also, the issue of genocide that previous speakers spoke about, that's being sorted out in the International Court of Justice, and the ICJ has not reached the conclusion that Israel is conducting genocide, and Israel is not carrying out genocidal activities. Israel is defending itself. Israel is hitting Hamas. Israel is striking targets of Hamas. Unfortunately, in harm's way, civilians get hurt because Hamas is embedded in civilian populations, unfortunately. Israel's not targeting civilians. Israel's aim is not to kill children, not to kill civilians, unlike what Sahar said earlier. Israel is fighting a just war, and hopefully it will end soon.
But Dan, how much public support, even among people of Israel, hasn't public support eroded for this operation in Gaza?
Yes, of course. I'm also against the continuation of this war. I want to see a hostage release deal. I want to see a ceasefire. I want this war in Gaza to end. And I know that many Israelis support that. But hopefully we'll get to the right terms when Hamas and Israel agree on these terms. And now it's being negotiated in Cairo. And hopefully we'll get somewhere, some concrete results in the near future.
Let me move on to another complicated mess, and that would be what's happening in Syria, the sudden advance of rebels who took over one of the country's largest cities, Aleppo, and appear to be advancing. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a former offshoot of al-Qaeda. Joost, let me turn to you. Where is all this headed, and what do you make of the timing?
So I definitely don't know where it is headed, but we saw today that HTS, this group that you mentioned, is headed for Hama, the city of Hama. It's already taken a good part of northern Hama province from government forces and its allies. So whether they will be able to take Hama and then move on to Homs and eventually Damascus is a big question. Certainly the government is rallying support from its allies outside Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, but and this comes to why now. Those actors are not actually in a position to provide much assistance to government forces at this time. Russia is tied down in Ukraine and has already, before these latest events, had withdrawn a lot of its forces and equipment from Syria to Russia and to Ukraine for the Ukraine effort. Hezbollah, of course, is not in a position to do anything at this point in Lebanon, let alone in Syria. So and Iran is also on the back foot, but we see some pro-Iran militias, especially from Iraq, that are potentially still involved in fighting on behalf of the government side. But right now, it is anybody's guess which way this conflict is going to go. But what we've seen is, of course, a quite striking advance by the rebel forces out of their little corner of northwestern Syria in Idlib in the last few days.
We only have a few seconds, and I'm going to turn this question to Sahar and Khalil, but please remember, keep it short. I want to end perhaps on a rather different topic, and the issue of race involved in whether we're talking about Palestinians, whether we're talking about immigrants, the way Western media has perhaps covered this story, and the reluctance of Western governments to condemn what's happening in Gaza, to unequivocally stand against what's been happening with Palestinians in Gaza. Sahar, I just want to give you the final word. Is there a racial element to all of this?
Well, I wrote an entire book about it called The Racial Muslim.
But keep it short. We have 20 seconds.
Absolutely. And in fact, when you are privileged and your views and experiences and humanity is centered, then you know that you have become you're racially constructed, or your socially constructed race is whiteness. That has not been the case with Palestinians, Muslims, and Arabs. They're racialized as brown, black, inferior, heathen, and terrorist. And I think we need to address that disparity in media coverage, and we need to value the humanity of both Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Muslims and Christians in the Middle East. That is not what is happening in the Western media, especially in the United States.
I know these are difficult conversations, and we don't always agree. We don't have to always agree, but we have to be respectful. Thank you for all of you for chiming in, for joining us. Dan Arbell, Khalil Jahshan, Sahar Aziz, and Joost Hiltermann. We really appreciate it. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington.